As the early hours of the invasion were absolutely instrumental and decisive in determining the outcome of the largest ever combined international military assault in all of human history, primarily led by China, with Russia as the other de facto coalition leader, as they, after China, were the second largest contributor of forces and resources for the invasion in the DFW campaign. By 1 a.m., or effectively 1 hour into the nationwide invasion, a number of both objective clearance and flank clearance operations were already immediately underway. These mostly spearheaded by PLA air assault forces of the PLA's active duty 83rd Group Army, which contributed its 83rd Air Assault Brigade to be effectively attached to the 59th PLA Reserve Group Army for the express purposes of this invasion. As these highly mobile, rapidly deployable forces struck like lightning, they were joined by the very heavy and powerful ground forces of the PLA's 59th Reserve Group Army, which itself was in overall command of the CHICOM forces in the DFW operation, which even included, besides the attached Air Assault Brigade, two paramilitary National Construction and Production Corps battalions, their entire purpose being, after the victory had been achieved in the nationwide invasion, to effectively move in to the captured main objectives, such as the key airports and installations, and effectively build them up as megafobs, as well as also branching out and constructing additional combat outposts, as the original CCP regime invasion properties, which were used to springboard the Trojan shock armies, would also become combat outposts in their own right, as these areas were still heavily stocked with logistical supplies and other assets for their invasion forces. These would all form a network of occupation bases that would be located not only throughout the DFW metro area, but throughout the nation as a whole. As the external invasion prong of Group Armies 7 through 13, as in accordance with fourth generation warfare doctrines, needed all the key nodes up and down the major invasion routes to be absolutely and thoroughly secured by the Trojan shock army components, and this no less included the DFW metro area, as the local Trojan shock armies were racing to bring this gargantuan metropolitan area under their complete and total control to allow the unimpeded passage of Group Armies 7 through 13 en route deeper inland, where they would begin to shed some of their forces before the rest would spread out in Kansas and link up with external components coming down from Canada in the middle of the nation. All of these heavy-handed external component reinforcements within the confines of fourth generation doctrines were there to effectively provide the heavy and rapidly moving reinforcements that all of the Trojan shock forces located in all the far-flung corners of the land required in order to be able to either sustain their operations or serve as replacements for the forces in their operations, as this would allow the different Trojan shock forces to branch out from their primary invasion zones and begin to clear secondary and then finally tertiary areas to bring the nation under complete and total control. This effectively would take time as it related to tertiary areas, but the war planners had thoroughly expected that the coalition forces would rapidly take control of the primary areas, which were the most important areas of the nation in terms of economic, also military industrial, as well as also even military terms, as many of these areas included major military installations, and also political significance relating to the capture of key capital cities, whether regional, as in states, or whether the national capital, which by now was under heavy assault by PLA forces, as well as Pakistani and Belarusian forces, later to be joined by a small Russian contingent moving through the area as it pertained to the national capital. That battle would last several days, as the defenders would actually have time to establish defensive belts within the city. However, with the use of air assault forces in the DFW battle, this was effectively stymied, as the downtowns of the two largest cities, both Dallas and Fort Worth in this area, were thoroughly saturated by air assault forces backed up by artillery, as well as also air power, and they were rapidly, already within hour one, seizing control of both downtown areas as the combat was now beginning to unfold, as they had arrived and landed their initial companies of air assault infantry, as they were also backed up by attack helo gunships such as the highly formidable and advanced Z-10 attack helo gunships of the Combat Aviation Company in each and every air assault battalion, as the Transport Aviation Company in each and every air assault battalion utilized the Z-20 utility helicopters to shuttle in a squad of troops per helo, as all of these forces, again, were backed up by the heavy hand of not only the PLA's additional ground forces in the area from the 59th Group Army, but also from the air, as the PLAAF had effectively wrested control of the airspace over the DFW metro area, as well as having refueling aircraft such as the YU-20s and YY-20s located in the area as well of North Texas and southern Oklahoma. These had a 90,000-pound fuel capacity and were the third largest refueling aircraft in the world in terms of their capacity, as they could keep fighter squadrons as well as heavy strategic bombers in the air for extended amounts of time. These aircraft would effectively linger over the DFW battle space for a number of hours before returning to be refitted with different ammunition types as it related to the fighter aircraft, as their second sorties would involve more air-to-ground munitions, as they would effectively be utilized in a strike aircraft capacity to back up the actual strike aircraft, like the very powerful JH-7s, which carried nearly 20,000 square pounds of air-to-ground munitions, as they also had electronic warfare capabilities, which were highly advanced, utilizing their KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods. The same was also true of the much heavier H-6K strategic bomber aircraft, which also had these same capabilities, as the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes had completely neutralized in not only the grid throughout the nation, but also the ISR and communications capabilities of America. All they were effectively left with were multi-mission radars and some air defense radars that were not dependent upon satellite or upon the grid to function, and thus were generator powered and had to be effectively countered by the use of electronic warfare assets, either land or air-based primarily, but also in coastal areas, sometimes sea-based, from vessels of the coalition. As these aircraft were now operating over the skies of the DFW area, they were giving full close air support to the ground forces, as well as striking strategic targets, as well as also even the strategic bomber aircraft being utilized in a tactical capacity, as they would wipe out two entire units. In the case of the fighting going on in Fort Worth, one H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft would fly over the 1st of the 204th and not only destroy the Lockheed Martin plant in a strategic bombing raid, but also most of the entire 1st of the 204th SHORAD battalion along with it. This battalion, coming from the Mississippi National Guard 66th Troop Command, had been effectively moved into the area to provide force protection for the nearby Naval Air Station, which was effectively up the street, up Lockheed Martin Boulevard from the plant, as well as the plant itself. Although the SHORAD capabilities were certainly not formidable enough to challenge the PLAAF's air dominance, they were also heavily hit by artillery, as the 24th Light Infantry Brigade had its own artillery battalion in the area, as well as also the massive artillery forces of the 19th Artillery Brigade, which also effectively hit this area exceedingly hard with howitzer and rocket fires, but primarily howitzer in the case of the Naval Air Station and the Lockheed Martin plant. Also, the A300 systems, also known as the PHL-16s of the 77th PLA Group Army, also fired from over 200 miles away to support the operation occurring in the DFW Metroplex using their BRE-8 or Fire Dragon tactical ballistic missiles, which were miniature tactical ballistic missiles that were artillery-based, to strike the Naval Air Station. As all of this was already unfolding within the first hour, including the landings of the air assault battalions in the DFW International Airport and the south of the airport grounds to cut off retreat as the heavy armored forces, 3 battalions from the 35th Armored Brigade, armor battalions with heavy artillery support from their own self-propelled PLZ-05 155mm artillery battalion, were conducting the assault on the DFW International Airport with air assault support, as also an additional air assault battalion had been sent to the downtown of Dallas and would likewise be backed up by armored forces, although these would not come from the 35th Armored Brigade, but would come from the 16th Infantry Division, committing one of its 2 brigades, its 2 comprising brigades, armored battalions, to effectively destroy the 2nd of the 198th, as American military units were amongst the highest priorities in terms of targeting and as objectives to be destroyed. The PLA committed considerable resources to this effort, as not only the PLA ground forces or the Army was involved in this endeavor, but as were the missile forces from the Strategic Missile Forces, including the 612th and 613th and even 616th Strategic Missile Forces brigades, as the 612th and 613th were across the border in Mexico, and the 616th was an actual Trojan unit in eastern Texas. They utilized considerable cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes against strategic and tactical targets, which included military units as well, as also the air power committed was exceedingly massive, as also in this area, not only were there 3 H-6K heavy strategic bombers allocated to this campaign in the DFW area, but also 2 of the even heavier and even more powerful H-20 stealth bombers, as these could carry 45 tons of air-to-ground munitions, which effectively was 90,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions. These were exceedingly destructive aircraft, and they were also stealth aircraft. Although the H-6K had its electronic warfare capabilities going for it, the H-20 was a stealth aircraft and had the 5th generation appeal of being a heavy stealth bomber, and could fly at exceedingly high altitudes and jettison their payload on cities and targets below them, as these 2 H-20 stealth bombers committed to this campaign from the PLAAF, as they had broken off from their bomber squadron in eastern Texas as they flew over American airspace, 2 would be utilized to hit strategic military-industrial targets and the surrounding areas, of course, as collateral damage, as the military-industrial sites were considered high-priority targets, as America had at one time recently only had 1 artillery plant manufacturing shells in Pennsylvania. They had recently constructed a 2nd plant in Mesquite, Texas, as Mesquite was just to the east of Dallas, as this was a suburb of Dallas. The General Dynamics artillery plant would be heavily hit by an H-20 strategic bombing raid from one of 2 aircraft, while the other H-20 and the rest of the payload on the H-20 that hit the General Dynamics plant would be utilized against other military-industrial targets in the city, as the fighter aircraft, like the J-11 Squadron and the J-10 Squadron, gained complete and total control over the airspace over the battlefield. The heavy strategic bomber aircraft and strike aircraft, like the JH-7s, could operate with impunity, as they were also aided not only by the potent air defense network from the 59th PLA Group Army, as their 59th Air Defense Artillery Brigade was operating in the area, they also had assistance from the SHORAD battalions within the maneuver elements, which included the SHORAD battalion within the 24th Light Infantry Brigade, the SHORAD battalion within the 16th Infantry Division, the SHORAD battalion within the 35th Armor Brigade, and also, again, the 59th Air Defense Artillery Brigade and its integrated short, medium, and high-altitude, medium-ranged air defense systems, such as their very potent HQ-2J system, which was an old system but was excessively upgraded to the point to where it was a highly formidable air defense system in possession of second-line units, such as the Reserve 59th Group Army, while the latest and greatest of the Chinese air defense systems went to the active duty forces before they began proliferating into some of the reserve assets, the reserve forces of the PLA. As all of these forces were working together perfectly in terms of the air power and the ground forces, including their highly mobile and capable air defense assets, the city erupted in combat as confused and terrified civilians were fleeing in multiple directions as they were not sure where to go, as artillery, including rocket and both howitzer, were splashing through the city, hitting various targets, including armed reactionary civilian elements that were assembling in large groups that were deemed as a threat by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. And as the combat was now unfolding for major objectives, including the red zones of downtown Dallas and downtown Fort Worth, as well as also the major airports, such as the DFW airport, most importantly, as well as also the Meacham Airport and Love Field, which would be captured after the fall of downtown Dallas, the Naval Air Station and also the Taylor Army Heliport, which was a Reserve and National Guard installation, were hit heavily by everything from artillery to air power to missile strikes, as well as also ground-based fires from armored forces, including tank shells coming in from an armored battalion that struck the Naval Air Station from the 35th Armored Brigade, among other weapons. As the flank clearance operations were also unfolding throughout the city to support the operations occurring against the DFW International, the downtown of Dallas, the battle for the Naval Air Station, and the Taylor Army Heliport in the downtown of Dallas. The units of the defending American forces, again, were a very high priority target, and a mechanized infantry battalion from the 16th Infantry Division would be tasked with the absolute and total destruction of the 2nd of the 142nd, an American mechanized infantry battalion belonging to the 56th Infantry Brigade combat team, the chief defending force in the DFW metro area. They had been tasked with a special mission to guard the new Raytheon site, as the old Raytheon factory and office site in Garland had effectively been moved to Richardson, just north of downtown Dallas. This mechanized infantry battalion was tasked not only with the destruction of the 2nd of the 142nd, but also the seizure of the premises after it would be heavily hit by a strategic air raid that would also serve a tactical purpose of assisting in the eradication of the 2nd of the 142nd. However, with emerging threats throughout the battlefield on the flanks, it was imperative, as this mechanized infantry battalion from the 16th Infantry Division raced up I-35E before getting onto I-30 and leaving in the Fair Park area to move to the northeast, that they would have to effectively stop and engage an emerging group of armed reactionary civilians along I-635, which were seen as a major threat, as they potentially could harass the supply lines deep into the city for the different assaulting forces, and this could not be permitted, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system connected to the ubiquitous mass surveillance apparatus of the PLA forces had seen all of the different clusters of armed reactionary civilians coming out of their neighborhoods, their homes, moving together effectively, which made them massive targets, although they had to do this for communications reasons, as they no longer had radio or long-distance communications. They only had line of sight and earshot communications, or could use runners. They effectively made themselves targets, as the surveillance apparatus could see them clustering in these groups, and thus made them easy to eradicate. As one combat engineer battalion from the 40th Combat Engineer Brigade would likewise be committed to this operation to clear the flanks in this area before moving northward, as an additional cluster of armed reactionary civilians would emerge, as a grouping of just over 200 would emerge perilously near the headquarters battalion over the entire 59th Group Army, the combat engineers, and the mechanized infantry battalion from the 16th ID, whose main priority was to reach and destroy the 2nd of the 142nd, would effectively quickly work together in this area to eradicate armed reactionary civilians within a span of an hour, as the mechanized infantry battalion would operate alongside of the combat engineers for effectively 1 hour's time before disengaging to continue to their main objective, as the combat engineers would then remain in the area, take over the mopping up operation after the main battle had concluded in this particular part of the city, before they themselves would then move north and engage again an additional emerging grouping of armed reactionary civilians. As the combat engineers of the PLA were a highly technologically advanced and very capable combat force, as these, again, similar to the Russian combat engineers, were like elite assault infantry, but these were very high-tech forces, utilizing armed quad-legged robots as well as unarmed quad-legged robots for planting demolition charges, but they also had an even more nasty weapon up their sleeves, which consisted of the DJI track-based robots, which were utilized for demolition purposes, as 4 pounds of C4 would be placed on one of these robots, and they would be driven into a location to demolish it, as in enemy fortifications, or buildings, or bunkers of any type, or also even obstacles, if need be. But again, they could also use quad-legged robots for this, but they often preferred these much smaller, enormously mass-produced, and very cheap and effective systems for the purposes of demolition. They also had their FPV drone operators within each combat engineer battalion, who aided the ground troops operating in the front lines, at the lines of contact as they developed with FPV drone support. Of course, there was also the CH-901A loitering munitions, or kamikaze drones, that effectively, like the FPV drones, but far more destructive, were there to support the troops in the field, as often these combat engineers could send their armed robots into dangerous areas first. These assisted heavily as mobile, heavy fire support platforms for the troops following behind them, as the combat engineers also used several different types of engineering vehicles, such as the GCZ-115, also the CSL-130, which was a mine-clearing engineering vehicle. They, of course, also came with their ZBD-04A infantry fighting vehicles and their standard armor personnel carriers, the Type 89As. As the combat was heavy all throughout the city, the combat engineers were an outstanding force to throw into action against all of these developing combat zones, as they were now beginning to emerge, as resistance had now gradually sprung up all throughout the metro area. As we go to the map of the northeast of Dallas, as the combat engineers from the 40th Combat Engineering Brigade of the PLA's Reserve 59th Group Army, in conjunction with the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, advancing against the forces in Richardson of the American 2nd of the 142nd, who were guarding the Raytheon facility, These forces, again, would shortly work together to eradicate the threat on their flanks before the mechanized infantry forces would disengage after an hour of combat and effectively converge onto their main objective, which was, again, the absolute and total annihilation of the 2nd of the 142nd, as well as also assisting in the destruction of the new Raytheon facility. As we go to the map, along I-635, armed reactionary civilian clusters had been immediately spotted by the ISR surveillance apparatus as satellite feeds, the high-altitude drone feeds, and increasingly, as the troops arrived into the area, the squad-level quadcopter feeds all worked together to map out the battlefield in real time, placing allied and enemy icons on every combat data link, whether squad-based NCO combat data links, which were effectively handheld, or whether vehicle-based, which again updated the battlefield by the literal second as the ISR capabilities both would see and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system would either remove destroyed enemy or allied forces as they were eradicated on the battlefield and thus keep the troops steadily updated on exact positions, as well as also preventing friendly fire incidences by using this information and data to effectively guide the troops on what weapons were safe to use, the angle and traverse of weapons, and when certain weapons were safe to use to prevent friendly fire incidences while economizing and maximizing the capabilities of their firepower against enemy forces at the same time. As all of this real-time information allowed the PLA to be a highly rapid force in terms of their reaction to the developing situations, they and their well-prepared logistical assets enabled them to conduct a wide array of all types of operations all throughout the battle space, unimpeded by any type of logistical issues, as again, they had stockpiled logistics for literal decades for this war, as well as also the ISR, IT, and AI superiority, granting them capabilities that effectively most other nations simply didn't possess. As Russia was even just behind China, and China was the world leader in AI. They combined their capabilities to make the most advanced, not only surveillance apparatus, but also artificial intelligence apparatus ever seen in human history. As in this particular area, there would be some close air support provided by J-10 fighter aircraft, as again, they carried small numbers of air-to-ground munitions, at least on their initial sorties, because they were primarily concerned with combat air patrols over the airspace in the battlefield. And as most of their weapons were air-to-air, some of these aircraft carried a pair of 1,000-pound laser-guided munitions, and in some cases even air-to-ground standoff weapons such as the KD-88 air-to-ground standoff cruise missiles, which were utilized against ground targets in different parts of the city by some of these aircraft when necessary. As again, it was often not required that the fighter aircraft be utilized in close air support operations, as the very powerful and heavily armed JH-7s could cover most of that, even when striking key objectives in other units and other key areas, such as at the DFW International Airport, the Naval Air Station, and other sites. They carried a combined amount of 240,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions with the entire 12-aircraft squadron, and for the most part could handle any developing situations in addition to their standard key targeting objectives as per the original war planning. As the fighter aircraft in this occasion would be utilized because they were in the immediate area and were first on scene, one J-10 would drop 2 laser-guided precision munitions on this site right here, destroying this building completely, along with rocket fires and heavy mortar strikes coming into the area as well, hitting this building, the part of the building that hadn't been completely eradicated by the 2,000-pound munition strike, as well as also CM-502KG dual-purpose anti-ship, anti-tank missiles being fired into this building as well by a Wing-Lung 2 dedicated combat drone. Again, these were produced in such enormous quantities because they were exceedingly cheap, highly effective, and reliable, and were easy to produce. And China had thousands of these drones already on standby, as well as also even more advanced models of combat drones than the Wing-Lung 2, but the Wing-Lung 2 remained as it was already produced in such large quantities, as well as also the loitering munitions CH-901As having had been fired by the headquarters company of the battalion, of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, by their dedicated combat drone section operating the TEL-based or truck-based system with 48 tubes, as they could fire 48 of these devastating loitering munitions in a single salvo. These were equipped with fragmentation warheads, as they had the option of fragmentation, HE, which was high explosive, or also even heat for heavy enemy weapons such as main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and even light bunkers, as these, being equipped with fragmentation, were more than adequate for the types of targets that were expected to be engaged as per the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which advised the forces on what weapons to even utilize. These were more than a match for soft-skinned civilian vehicles and clusters of civilians on the ground, as in this particular area, this is a 1 mile by 1 kilometer area of northeast Dallas near Garland. To the immediate east and off this map was where the combat engineers were operating on other streets, as their battalion had arrived at roughly the same time as had the mechanized infantry, now moving into the area. As the dismounted platoons from one platoon of this company was on the access road moving north, while another company was on the next street, or another platoon rather of the company was on the next street over, and then their third combat platoon was on the third street over, with their headquarters platoon in the parking lot of a shopping center. As these forces were now beginning to move through the area to clear all opposition out from the area to free up their flanks for their main assault, in conjunction with the combat engineers operating in neighborhoods that were just off this map. The two companies pictured of the 6 total mechanized infantry companies, 1 fire support company and their headquarters and support company, which is their command and logistical elements of the battalion, were committed into this combat in this particular area, as there was also another mechanized infantry company now operating to the immediate west of I-635, as I-635 in this particular area runs nearly north to south. It's mostly running in a curve around the city, but this is a smaller section of the highway depicted, so therefore it is running mostly north-south, although again it kind of curves to the slight northwest. As this platoon was now moving through the area along with this platoon on the access road, armed reactionary civilians were already now being engaged, as contact erupted immediately between the two sides, as there were groupings of them in these grassy areas that effectively separated the street from the access road. They were now in the prone position, trying to fire at the vehicles as they approached, doing nothing to them. Again, at this point, these armed reactionary civilians effectively were only equipped with their small arms. Very few of them had had the implements immediately in front of them this early on to be able to produce Molotovs to be utilized as anti-armor weaponry, as some sites in this area had already been hit by mortar strikes, such as this building that was heavily pummeled by 120mm mortars coming in from the Mechanized Infantry Forces Fire Support Company, equipped with a single platoon of PLL-05 dual-purpose assault gun/mortars. There were also, again, rocket strikes coming in from the Fire Support Company's 2 firing batteries of multiple launch Type 63 light artillery 130mm rocket systems. These now being utilized in conjunction with the 120mm dual-purpose assault gun/mortars, as this was now being used in the capacity of a mortar, were now hitting targets in support of their advancing infantry squads as they moved through houses and commercial buildings in this mixed commercial and residential area. As there was a gas station, shopping centers, and office buildings, and more commercial sites, shopping centers, and so on and so forth, there was also housing neighborhoods and an apartment complex, a hospital, and again, commercial buildings, which were hit heavily by two 1,000-pound laser-guided precision munitions, along with heavy 120mm mortar strikes and even 130mm rocket strikes hitting this area, completely eradicating this entire grouping of armed reactionary civilians at the opening of the map, including the hits from the dual-purpose anti-ship, anti-tank missiles fired by this Wing Loon 2 at the remains of this building, as the precision munitions, missiles, mortar strikes, and rockets are all hitting at roughly the same time. A highly coordinated effort which completely demolished this entire city block. As all of that was going on, buildings across the street were badly damaged from the strike and would thus be eventually cleared by the advancing PLA troops of these two mechanized infantry companies depicted in this particular area of the city. As this was a squad from the headquarters platoon that had taken to the roof to effectively observe the situation and provide oversight on these streets as these squads advanced, as this platoon had three of its squads on this side as they were dismounted from their infantry fighting vehicle and four armor personnel carriers, their ZBD-04A and Type 89As, their APCs. They had two other squads on this side of the street, which were working closely with this platoon and their squads, as they had two squads here, one in a rolling T, one in a single column formation, another in a single column, just having cleared this building. And effectively, there are two other squads here clearing the gas station and moving through this area, along with the vehicles moving up as their squads advance to provide them steady fire support directly in front down the street at enemy forces. As personnel were running out of this building, they had been eradicated at the opening of the map, as many things were going on, by a combination of vehicle-based fires, 100mm shells from the lead ZBD-04A of this column, of this platoon, as well as also 30mm autocannon fire from the same ZBD-04A, as well as also the strikes from these missiles, as these personnel were fleeing at the time of the strike that was occurring against this city block with the two 1,000-pounders, the four dual-purpose anti-ship, anti-tank weapons, 130mm strikes, 20mm strikes repeatedly on this site, completely annihilating this area. As these forces had fled from this building, others were on the roof, and they were primary targets for the AI target-seeking mode on the loitering munitions known as the CH-901As. Again, these were equipped with fragmentation rounds, and they sought out high-priority targets such as personnel that were on tall buildings or tall areas in terms of geography. If it was out in a natural area, such as a forest or mountainous area, these would naturally target those on higher positions as they were deemed as a threat, because naturally enemy forces on higher positions have an expanded view and can utilize anti-tank weapons or even air defense weapons from high positions. Although again, the civilians did not have such things at this time, these again were automatically deemed high priority targets and were thus struck by the loitering munitions equipped with their fragmentation warheads. As the platoons were on the move, again the vehicles moving up as these troops were clearing each and every city block, as this platoon and this platoon and this platoon here clearing the highway and alongside of it were all working in harmony, being guided all the way through by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. On the other side of the highway, one platoon had made a defensive ring around the headquarters platoon vehicles, which also utilized their MRAPs, which were their most potent vehicles of the headquarters vehicles, as security vehicles to secure their fuel, their fuel truck, their armored recovery vehicle, logistical trucks, and their commander's vehicle. As all of this was going on, and this platoon was moving through this area, and this platoon was moving through, again, briefly, fire had been exchanged between the vehicles and these personnel here, as well as these personnel taking cover in these areas, and they were completely destroyed by the vehicle-based fires, including the firepower coming from Type 89As and this platoon forming the defensive ring in this apartment complex, utilizing their 30mm autocannon fire, as well as also their 100 millimeter fire, like so. Like here's the 100 millimeter main gun. There's a 30 millimeter autocannon effectively attached directly to it. There's also 2 missile pods for HJ-09 or HJ-08 anti-tank guided missiles, and of course the 7.62 by 54 millimeter general purpose coaxial machine gun utilized to effectively fight against dismounts or infantry-based forces, especially when they get near the vehicle. As all of this firepower, including the heavy machine gun fire coming from the W-85 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns aboard the armor personnel carriers, were being directed and vectored effectively against American forces, they were rapidly cut down as, again, another grouping was fleeing from this building, and they were also exchanging fire back and forth as these forces moved into the area. And this particular platoon, moving up this street here near this access road where this platoon is, of this company, would effectively dismount all its squads to clear buildings in the area, as one squad would effectively provide mutual support to the vehicles in a wedge formation to watch different sides and also support their 2 squads bounding towards this building. The vehicles, as these squads were clearing this area and this squad would hold this area, would then move up and deploy their last 2 squads. As again, this squad was here in a wedge to provide fire support to these squads going in the buildings. The wedge has a 2-side view, as in terms of viewing the battle space, and even forward as well if need be. And they were, of course, in the prone position, and their vehicles ahead of them providing them support, as there were enemy personnel in this building firing out of the building 100 millimeter fire, 30 millimeter autocannon fire, and the ZBDO-4A leading the platoon, in addition to firing their 100 millimeter and 30 millimeter weapons, would also fire 2 HJ-09 ATGMs into this building. As they did so, and these squads had tactically bounded and covered into this area, this platoon was moving up as well while this action was occurring here. And as they moved into the area, they cut these forces down. As all of this was going on, many things occurring at the same time, these 2 half squads of this double column formation on the highway moving through the area as 5 men on each side of the highway, median, were moving through the area. They broke into their 2 half squad forces and moved through the area, and as they reached this point, they then received contact, and thus then began bounding and covering tactically, where one squad would lay down fire, the other would bound ahead, they would lay down fire, and the next one would bound ahead, lay down fire, and then so on and so forth. As this was occurring, these forces were trying to get through the area. Many were being cut down by these forces, as again, so many different actions are occurring on this map at roughly the same time. Covering it all is very difficult, but that is effectively real-life battle. As in this side of the combat, on this side of the highway, this neighborhood was effectively being flushed out by these 3 squads from this platoon. The other 2 squads of this platoon were moving through this apartment block right here, and this squad and the wedge would go in and clear the building, while these 2, according to standard building clearance procedures, would stay outside and provide support. And as the squad would help these 2 finish off these personnel, finding nobody in this building, they would then bound and clear this building, as this squad would then join them, with this squad having moved behind the rolling T, as these buildings were somewhat tall. They were multi-floor, as the rolling T is a great formation for not only watching upper floors and the front at the same time, but also additional 360-degree security by the follow-up forces within the squad, as they followed behind the lead 3-point men in this type of tactical formation. As in this particular image, they're going in to clear a commercial building or perhaps a hospital, and they're encountering some armed resistance, but the point man of this rolling T formation, or one of 3-point men rather, is wielding his QBJ-201 light machine gun, which had an excessively high rate of fire and cut these personnel down, just spraying them as they're running toward this building. This rifleman with his QBZ-95 is firing at someone taking cover on the top floor, while this soldier here is firing up to somebody firing out the window, returning fire at him. As the rounds splash into this area, because they're moving rapidly, these forces have found targets as well, including this man down here with his ATGM, which was his HJ-08 anti-tank guided missile, and they were firing at their targets accordingly, as tactically they still had their staggered weapons with other personnel watching the other side to maintain 360-degree security as they raid this building. As all of this was going on, these tactical formations gave these forces a high capability in terms of fighting the American armed reactionary civilian elements who lacked any cohesion, coordination, or any real tactical knowledge for the most part, unless they were combat veterans or had some sort of training, which wasn't the case in many of these situations. These forces were rapidly eradicated, these reactionary elements, because in this urban area, the demographic was a bit different in this part of the city, and there were not very many veterans. It was mostly armed, ordinary civilians that were effectively moving out of their neighborhoods, their apartments, their homes, and were now engaging the PLA forces as they came into the area. As it was Texas, there were still many armed people, regardless of whether they had training or not, but training and logistical support, as well as also command and control and tactics, play a key role in a force and determine the outcome of whether it'll be victorious or not. And as the PLA had total AI and IT and surveillance dominance with their ISR phenomenal capabilities and their most advanced AI systems in the world with their heavy firepower dominance, they simply dominated the battlefield. Again, they would only engage these forces for a 1 hour span in this area as their main objective after defeating these forces and leaving the mopping up operation to the Combat Engineer Battalion operating immediately off the map to their east. They would then proceed, after the combat engineers would conduct the mop-up operation, to their main objective in Richardson, which was the new Raytheon site, as it had been moved, again, from the Garland site to the Richardson site. And thus, it was very important to the Americans to defend it, as again, the Americans were never sure what was coming, as they only knew of the Sino-Russian naval drills and were not exactly sure if it would be a limited strike or if proxies would be used or what would happen. And thus, they were very haphazard in deploying their forces as a result, and they spread their forces very thin as well. As also, they had a hard time rapidly mobilizing forces to address the issue, as they were not sure, again, whether it would be a limited strike or a larger strike, and it ended up being the largest ever invasion in human history, topping even Operation Barbarossa during World War II, which until this invasion occurred had been the largest ever invasion in all human history. As, again, they would disengage the Mechanized Infantry Battalion coming from the 16th Infantry Division after an hour of combat clearing this area and would move on to their primary objective. They would be heavily assisted by tactical ballistic missile strikes coming in from the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade of the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, which was a Trojan unit in eastern Texas, as well as also YJ-18C cruise missiles, which were container-based cruise missiles, which were basically China's version of the Russian Club K. It was effectively a container-based cruise missile system, just as the Russians had their own, the Chinese did as well, which was the YJ-18C. These were now, at 2 a.m., firing their salvos as they would be timed to fire different salvos at different targets throughout the course of the invasion, as targeting data would be updated as some targets would change and situations would shift. 5 of these cruise missiles, the YJ-18Cs, which were not hypersonic, but they were supersonic, as in they broke the sound barrier, they were not subsonic, they flew into this area and would hit targets in the Raytheon site, in addition to the DF-15B tactical ballistic missiles fired by the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigades, and again, the heavy strategic bombers, namely 2 of the 3 H-6Ks, as the third was hitting another military-industrial site in White Settlement, namely the aircraft plant, the Lockheed Martin plant. These would hit heavily the entire Raytheon facility, and they would be effectively aided by the missile strikes as well into the area, and of course their own fire support company within the battalion. As in this particular area, by the time they reach this Highway 75, which bisects through the area of the city of Richardson, they would surround this relatively large area, as this area was effectively, in terms of scale, a 3-mile area by 1.5-mile area. It was a large area requiring effectively nearly all of the companies of the battalion to surround and assault it. The only company not pictured in this particular battle map was the headquarters and support company, which was located just off the map and to the east of Highway 75, as Highway 75 becomes I-45 as one were to reach downtown Dallas. In this particular area, as the battle would rage, the combat would be heavy, as incoming cruise and tactical ballistic missiles, as well as also a very powerful strategic bombing raid, which had a tactical capacity to it, as they would be hitting a tactical target, namely the American ground forces with their raid, as their raid effectively encompassed the entire plant, which contained many of these American forces. The Americans effectively became trapped in this area because of their command elements not being able to make rational decisions based off of a lack of actionable intelligence and ISR capabilities, as the tandem anti-sat and cyber strikes had effectively removed this capability, as well as communications. And the lieutenant colonel and his XO, or his executive officer, a major below him, were having a difficult time sending orders down to their company captains, as they were trying to effectively coordinate a response to what was occurring. And as their standing orders had been to defend the facility, they had decided to stay and fight. But this would cost the entire battalion its entire existence, as the fighting here would be excessively brutal, with the combined might of the PLAAF heavy strategic bombing raid, the tactical ballistic and cruise missile strikes, and the mechanized infantry forces moving into the area and simply overrunning and mopping up what was left, what had survived the strikes. There was also a JH-7 that would fire 2 KD-88 standoff cruise missiles from much further away and drop 8,000 pounds of munitions into the area as well. It would be a heavy strike involving enormous salvos of 130mm rockets from the Type 63 multiple launch rocket systems, as the Fire Support Company had 2 firing platoons of these, and of course their single platoon of 120mm PLL-05 dual-purpose assault gun / mortar weapons. There would also be an enormous number of loitering munitions as well, as the Americans were scattering in many directions. When this map opens up, they were trying to flee the heavy strategic bombing and missile strikes that were now beginning to come in, as a single platoon would make it into a nearby apartment complex, only to turn around to pivot to face their attackers as PLA forces would move into the area. Again, this semi-industrial, commercial, and residential area, which was within a relatively large area in terms of scale, combined to make a devastating battlefield for the American forces, as, again, all the heavy firepower wielded against them was more than a match, as they had no means by which to counter the heavy strategic bombing, missile strikes, as well as also the large salvo of 48 of the CH-901A loitering munitions armed with heat warheads, as they would destroy infantry fighting vehicles such as the Bradley IFVs. And of course, there were also the standard APCs, the M113s, that the Americans possessed as well, although these could be easily destroyed even by the heavy machine guns aboard the APCs of the PLA, the Type 89As of the PLA forces. The combination of all of this firepower, especially the ZBDO-4As with their two ATGMs, their HJ-09s, as well as also their very powerful 100mm main gun, which would shred a Bradley into scrap. Even the adjacent 30mm autocannon could do the same. All of this firepower combining together with the heavy strategic bombing and missile strikes, again, eradicated this entire battalion in a mere matter of minutes, as in under an hour's time, as the mopping up of the surviving forces that were just outside of the range of the destructive power of the missiles and airdropped munitions would be mopped up by the mechanized infantry troops, much like in this particular image as shown in this illustration or animation, if you will, of the combat. As some of their forces were dug in throughout the area, as they had requisitioned certain properties in addition to the plant, they had tried to dig foxholes and set up sandbag machine gun emplacements, although these would fail and fail miserably against the advance of the mechanized infantry after the heavy saturation of munitions from the PLAAF and strategic missile forces. As, again, the fire support company would contribute massively as well with their heavy 120mm mortars and 130mm multiple launch rocket systems. The infantrymen, as they would again assist the combat engineers in fighting their way through armed reactionary civilian forces in the area before converging and surrounding a large area containing the new Raytheon facility, the combat was on a strict timetable, and it was expected for these forces to operate at a very high tempo of operations. Effectively, they were forced to act as fast as was humanly possible, and many of the expectations placed on them were so high that many of the troops had a difficult time keeping pace with such a rapid tempo of operations, although it was done. Although after these operations, these troops would be excessively tired and worn out and would need a long rest period after 2 straight days of combat in the Dallas-Fort Worth area before their undisputed victory would occur. As most of the combat would wrap up by day 1, it was only because of this high tempo of operations that such achievements had been attained by the PLA forces. Speed was a major component in this entire endeavor, and the forces had to act fast and they had to hit hard. And the Americans were simply unprepared for such a thing in every form and facet, way, shape, and form, and therefore were eradicated in large numbers, including even non-combatants that were effectively just in the way of the heavy munition saturations and crossfire that was a result of such savage levels of combat, as no mercy was shown by the PLA against their enemies. They were indeed a very heavy-hitting, very professional, and very mighty force, as well as their gargantuan size and capabilities. Nobody could compete with the PLA, as they slashed their way through America. Objectives would be taken within hours to mere days before the entire national surrender would occur, wherein the Secretary of State would read the surrender broadcast, and it would be translated in the languages of the coalition, as America would officially be handed over to become a colony of the CCP regime, although this would not end the fighting, which would drag on for years as a large partisan uprising would naturally begin shortly after the surrender message, as different armed groups would begin to emerge that would be different from the armed reactionary civilians. No, these would be groups that would actually plan actions and delegate important positions to people that were capable and could handle certain positions, such as runners and scouts and medical personnel, logistical people, etc., etc. These groups would have a rough go at it to begin with, but over time, they would gradually acquire better and better weapons, and they would evolve their tactics alongside of such developments. And as naturally, in counterinsurgency campaigns, the insurgents always lose massively more life than the actual professional military forces of the occupation regimes. The revolving door of personnel would continue for a large amount of time, as America was the third most populated nation on Earth, and gradually, as discontent would spread and the fear of being effectively recruited into slave labor programs would also spread amongst the population, many would flee to the woods, to the mountains, to even into the deserts and caves, and hide out from this despotic, evil regime that planned to subjugate them and enslave them, and would then begin to fight back. As in the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series meant to highlight fourth-generation warfare doctrines, the second portion of this subseries will highlight the tactical movements as the PLA troops of two mechanized infantry companies swept through the area on either side of 635 in northeast Dallas. As again, combat engineers of one combat engineer battalion were immediately adjacent and off the map. This map highlights the actions of the mechanized infantry battalion from the 16th ID en route to their main objective, which again was to destroy the 2nd of the 142nd. As also the battle over the Raytheon plant and site in Richardson will also be covered in the next video installation of this sub-series of the larger Dallas-Fort Worth area campaign within this documentary. More to come in the next video.